When English settlers first landed on the coast of North America in 1607, they could not have imagined the world they were creating.
What began as a small and desperate colony in the wilderness would, over the course of 169 years.
4 centuries ago, on the muddy banks of a river in what is now Virginia, a handful of weary English settlers stepped ashore. They carried hopes, fears, and a royal charter, but no understanding of the world they were entering. Their goal was simple: to survive long enough to build England's first permanent colony in the New World. What they created was Jamestown. Fragile, violent, miraculous, and from its struggles came the seed of a new civilization. It was the spring of 1607. 3 small ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, had crossed the Atlantic after months of storms, hunger, and disease. Aboard were 104 Englishmen, gentlemen, craftsmen, soldiers, and servants, all sent by the Virginia Company of London to claim land and profit in the name of King James I. The dream was dazzling. Investors in London imagined rivers of gold, exotic spices, and a route to the riches of Asia. None realized that Virginia's true treasure would be survival itself. As the ships entered the wide mouth of Chesapeake Bay, the men saw forests stretching endlessly, the cries of birds echoing over still water. To them, it was a paradise. To the indigenous peoples who already lived there, it was home. The settlers chose a narrow peninsula along the James River, 40 miles inland, for safety from Spanish raiders. There they began building what they called James Fort, a wooden triangle of rough logs, built in haste, surrounded by uncertainty. Within weeks, the settlers realized that paradise was an illusion. The river's water was brackish. The summer air was thick with mosquitoes carrying disease. Food ran short. Many of the men were unprepared for labor, gentlemen unused to farming or carpentry. The indigenous Powhatan Confederacy, a network of powerful tribes, ruled by Chief Wahunsinoko, watched from the woods. At first there was cautious curiosity, even trade copper and beads exchanged for corn. But mistrust grew quickly. The English fenced the land, cut down trees, and demanded food. Skirmishes erupted, small at first, then deadly. By autumn, nearly half the settlers were dead. The survivors clung to their fort, writing desperate letters back to England, begging for supplies. One wrote, "There were never Englishmen left in such misery as we in this newly discovered Virginia." In the midst of despair rose an unlikely leader, Captain John Smith, a soldier and adventurer with a fierce sense of discipline. Smith believed work not status would save the colony. He imposed a rule that became legendary: "He that will not work shall not eat." Under Smith's command, Jamestown began to stabilize. He organized trading expeditions with nearby tribes and mapped the region's rivers and forests. He even met the Powhatan chief himself, navigating fragile diplomacy with courage and tact. It was during this period that one of history's most famous encounters occurred: the story of Pocahontas, the chief's young daughter. Though often romanticized, their relationship was primarily one of cultural exchange and fragile peace. Pocahontas's visits to Jamestown helped ease tensions and provided food when the settlers were starving. But peace was fleeting. When Smith was injured in a gunpowder explosion in 1609 and forced to return to England, chaos returned with him. What followed was one of the darkest winters in American history. Cut off from supply ships, surrounded by hostile tribes, and ravaged by disease, the settlers faced famine. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known as the Starving Time. Of the 500 colonists alive in the autumn, only 60 survived the spring. Accounts tell of desperate men boiling leather, eating rats, even resorting to cannibalism. A witness later wrote, "Nothing was spared to maintain life." When new settlers arrived in May 1610, led by Lord de la Ware, they found skeletal survivors ready to abandon Jamestown forever. The newcomers ordered them to stay. The colony, barely alive, was forced to begin again. Jamestown's rebirth came from an unexpected source crop. In 1612, a colonist named John Rolfe began experimenting with seeds of a sweeter variety of tobacco brought from the Caribbean. The soil of Virginia proved perfect for it. Tobacco quickly became the colony's lifeline, the brown gold that transformed Jamestown from a failed outpost into a profitable enterprise. Within a decade, thousands of pounds of tobacco were being shipped to England. The demand was enormous, and the Virginia Company's fortunes soared. Fields spread across the riverbanks, worked by indentured servants or laborers, who sold years of their freedom for passage to the New World. But the hunger for land created new conflict. As tobacco plantations expanded, colonists encroached deeper into Powhatan territory. The fragile peace collapsed into open war. From 1622 onward, violence between settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy erupted in cycles. The First Powhatan War saw villages burned and hundreds killed. The English retaliated with equal brutality, seeking to dominate rather than coexist. The clash revealed a tragic pattern that would repeat across the continent: the relentless expansion of European settlement and the destruction of indigenous worlds. Amid the hardship, an extraordinary experiment took shape. In 1619, the settlers established the House of Burgesses, the first elected assembly in the English colonies. It was a modest beginning, just 22 representatives meeting in a church, but it marked the birth of representative government in America. Ordinary settlers now had a voice in their own laws. In the same year, another event changed the colony forever. A Dutch ship arrived carrying about 20 enslaved Africans. They were sold to the settlers, beginning the long and painful history of slavery in English America. Thus, 1619 became a year of contradiction: democracy and slavery. Liberty and bondage, two forces that would define the American story for centuries. Through the 1620s and 1630s, Jamestown evolved from a desperate outpost into a permanent settlement. Houses replaced tents. Churches rose from timber. Trade with England grew. Families arrived, bringing women and children who transformed the rough camp into a community. Yet, the colony remained perilous. Drought, disease, and Indian raids never ceased. The Virginia Company went bankrupt, and in 1624, King James I dissolved its charter, making Virginia a royal colony. Under royal control, order increased. Land ownership expanded. Plantations flourished. By the mid-1600s, thousands of English settlers lived along the James River. Jamestown, though small, was the beating heart of English America. Life in early Jamestown was harsh and hierarchical. Gentlemen still clung to their titles, but survival made equals of them all. Days began before sunrise. Men labored in the fields or repaired palisades. Women, once they arrived, managed households, tended gardens, and endured the constant threat of attack. The church bell governed life, calling not just to worship, but to meetings, drills, and justice. Punishments were severe. Theft could mean death. Laziness was a crime. Yet slowly, a sense of belonging emerged. Children born in Virginia called it home, no longer dreaming of England's shores. The new world was shaping them into something new, something that no longer fit neatly into the old empire's design. By the 1650s, Virginia was exporting millions of pounds of tobacco each year. Wealthy planters built grand estates along the river, their success resting on the labor of indentured servants and enslaved Africans. Smaller farmers pushed inland, claiming new land beyond Jamestown's limits. Towns sprouted along the coast. Churches, schools, and courts appeared. As generations passed, a distinct identity began to form. These were Englishmen, yes, but they were also something else. Virginians. They had carved lives out of wilderness, without direct guidance from the crown. Independence, though unspoken, had taken root. Even in prosperity, tension smoldered. By 1676, frustrations over taxes, land policies, and frontier defense exploded in Bacon's Rebellion. Led by Nathaniel Bacon, settlers marched against the colonial governor, accusing him of favoring the elite while neglecting frontier farmers. They burned Jamestown to the ground, the very symbol of English authority in America. The rebellion failed, but it exposed deep divisions between rich and poor, colonist and crown. The ashes of Jamestown reminded all that order built on inequality could not endure forever. Jamestown's story is not one of perfection, but of perseverance. It was a crucible where ideals were tested and contradictions born: freedom and oppression, faith and greed, survival and expansion. From its muddy fort emerged the patterns that would define American representative government, private enterprise, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity, often at terrible human cost. Though Jamestown eventually declined and the capital moved to Williamsburg, its spirit never vanished. Every town, every assembly, every declaration that followed carried its legacy. The struggles of those first settlers, hungry, sick, stubborn, laid the foundation of a nation that would one day proclaim liberty for all, even as it wrestled with its own moral failings. The year 1607 was not the birth of America, but it was the moment the seed was planted, a seed that would grow through war and revolution, through hope and hypocrisy, until it became the United States itself. When we look back on Jamestown, we see more than a settlement, we see a beginning. It was there that the English learned how to survive in a strange land. It was there that democracy took its first breath, and slavery its first shadow. It was there that America began not as a dream of perfection, but as a human struggle for meaning, survival, and identity. The story of Jamestown reminds us that every nation is born not in triumph, but in trial, not in certainty, but in faith. From a few ships and a handful of desperate souls came the foundations of a republic. And though centuries have passed, the river that once carried the Susan Constant still whispers the same truth. From struggle comes strength. From endurance, destiny. In the early 1600s, across the stormy Atlantic, a quiet revolution began not of swords and soldiers, but of faith and conscience. England was a land of power and prosperity, but also of spiritual turmoil. The Church of England, born from Henry VIII's defiance of Rome, demanded conformity. Those who resisted its authority faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. Among the restless and devout were a small group of men and women who believed that the Church had not gone far enough in its reform. They were called the Puritans, because they sought to purify the Church from corruption and worldly influence. And among them were those even more radical, who believed the only way to serve God truly was to separate entirely from the state church. These were the Pilgrims. They were not adventurers or soldiers. They were families, farmers, craftsmen, and preachers bound together by conviction. They dreamed not of wealth, but of worship. They longed for a land where they could pray without fear, live by their faith, and raise their children under God's law, not the king's. In 1608, a small congregation from the English village of Scrooby fled to the Netherlands, seeking refuge among more tolerant Protestants. For a time, they found peace, but it was a hard life. They were foreigners, strangers in a strange land, their children growing up speaking Dutch and forgetting their English ways. Their leader, William Bradford, wrote that they feared losing both their faith and their identity. And so, they made a bold decision. They would cross the ocean not for gold or glory, but for God. In 1620, they secured permission from the Virginia Company to settle in the New World. They sold what little they had and joined a larger group of English colonists. Together, they boarded a small weathered ship called the Mayflower. 102 souls set sail across the Atlantic, men, women, and children. Their journey lasted 66 days, through fierce storms that tossed the ship like driftwood. Many were seasick, some died. Yet through it all, they prayed and sang psalms, trusting that Providence guided their way. When land finally appeared on the horizon in November 1620, it was not Virginia, as they had planned, but the cold, rocky coast of what is now Massachusetts. They dropped anchor near Cape Cod, far north of their chartered destination. Winter was closing in, and they were utterly alone. Before stepping ashore, they gathered in the ship's cramped cabin and signed an agreement, a simple document that would echo through the centuries. The Mayflower Compact. In it, they pledged to form a civil body politic for their better ordering and preservation, promising to enact just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. It was not written by kings or nobles, but by ordinary people who believed that government derived from consent, not command. In that fragile moment, as the ship creaked in the November wind, democracy took root in the New World. They came ashore at a place they called Plymouth, after the English port they had left behind. The land was beautiful but brutal. The soil was thin, the winter harsh, and disease struck swiftly. By spring, nearly half the settlers were dead. They buried their loved ones on a hill overlooking the sea, marking graves with plain stones to hide their losses from any watching tribes. Yet, even in death, they found faith. Bradford later wrote, "It was not with tears of despair that we mourned, but with the hope of a greater promise." In the spring of 1621, as the survivors prepared to plant their first crops, a remarkable encounter changed everything. From the edge of the woods came a man who greeted them in English. His name was Samuset, a member of the Abenaki tribe. A few days later, he returned with another Mantis Squantum, whom the English called Squanto. Squanto had been captured years earlier by English explorers and taken to Europe, where he learned their language. By a twist of fate, he had returned to his homeland only to find his tribe wiped out by disease. Now, he became the Pilgrim's interpreter, guide, and friend. He taught them how to plant corn, fish the rivers, and navigate the seasons of this new land. Through his help, the settlers made peace with the nearby Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Chief Massasoit. This fragile alliance ensured their survival. That autumn, after a bountiful harvest, the Pilgrims held a feast of Thanksgiving, a simple celebration of gratitude for food, peace, and life itself. They invited the Wampanoag, who came bearing venison and gifts. For 3 days, they ate, played games, and offered prayers of thanks. It was a fleeting moment of harmony between two worlds, one that would later become mythologized as the first Thanksgiving. But the peace did not last forever. In the decades that followed, more English settlers arrived, not just separatists like the Pilgrims, but Puritans seeking to build their own vision of a godly society. In 1630, 11 ships carrying nearly 1,000 Puritans sailed from England under the leadership of John Winthrop. They established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, declaring that they would build a city upon a hill, a shining example of moral virtue for the world to see. Winthrop's vision was powerful but demanding. The Puritans believed that they were in covenant with God, chosen to create a pure and disciplined community. Every aspect of life, family, work, law, and worship was governed by Scripture. Church attendance was mandatory. Dissent was dangerous. They did not come for freedom of religion, as we know it today. They came for the freedom to practice their religion, their way. Those who disagreed found little tolerance. Ministers and magistrates held enormous power, and deviation from doctrine was treated as rebellion against God. Yet, even in their strictness, the Puritans laid foundations that would shape American life for generations. They valued literacy, so that every person could read the Bible. They founded schools and, in 1636, established Harvard College to train ministers. They built towns around meeting houses, where civil and spiritual life intertwined. In these small wooden structures, democracy was practiced in its infancy. Men gathered to vote on local matters, to discuss sermons, to debate laws. The seeds of American civic culture were sown in Puritan soil. But as communities grew, so did conflict. New ideas and personalities began to challenge the rigid order. Among them was Roger Williams, a fiery preacher who believed that church and state must be separate, and that faith could not be forced by law. For his radical beliefs, he was banished from Massachusetts in the dead of winter. He fled into the wilderness and found refuge among the Narragansett people. There, he founded Rhode Island, a colony built on principles of true religious freedom where all were welcome to worship as they chose. Another voice of defiance was Anne Hutchinson, a brilliant and outspoken woman who dared to interpret Scripture in her own gatherings. She preached that salvation was by grace, not works, challenging the Puritan ministers' authority. For this, she too was banished, her courage echoing through time as a symbol of conscience against conformity. As the Puritans spread across New England, their towns grew strong, their farms flourished, and their trade expanded. They built ships, exported timber and fish, and created the first complex economy in the New World. But their presence also brought devastation to the native peoples. European diseases, warfare, and displacement shattered indigenous societies. The balance that once existed between pilgrims and tribes like the Wampanoag was lost, replaced by suspicion and bloodshed. By the mid-1600s, the Puritan colonies had become powerful, self-sufficient, and deeply rooted in their faith. Yet beneath their confidence was an awareness of struggle, a belief that their lives were part of a divine test, that every drought, every illness, every war was a message from God. This worldview gave them strength but also fear. They saw themselves as chosen people in a promised land, but they also saw danger in every deviation from their covenant. In 1692, this fear reached its darkest expression in the Salem witch trials, when paranoia and superstition led to the execution of innocent men and women. The tragedy of Salem revealed both the brilliance and the burden of the Puritan mind, the yearning for purity and the terror of imperfection. And yet, even with their flaws, the Pilgrims and Puritans left an indelible mark. Their ideas of covenant and community, of hard work and education, of moral duty and civic responsibility, became part of America's character. They believed that they were building not just towns, but a divine experiment, a new world that could inspire the old. And in a sense, they succeeded. From their meeting houses came the first assemblies. From their covenants came constitutions. From their prayers came a vision of liberty that, over time, would grow beyond their imagination. The Pilgrims and Puritans did not create a perfect world, but they built a world that could grow. They carried faith across an ocean and planted it in the soil of a new continent. Their courage and contradictions became the first chapter in a story of freedom still being written. From the cramped decks of the Mayflower to the windswept shores of Plymouth, from the pulpits of Boston to the forests of Rhode Island, Their voices still echo a reminder that every new world begins with a few souls brave enough to dream it. When the first settlers came ashore in the early 1600s, they could not have imagined the world that would one day rise upon those shores. What began as a single struggling outpost in Jamestown soon multiplied into a tapestry of colonies stretching from the rocky coasts of New England to the warm plains of Georgia. Over the course of a century and a half, these colonies grew in size, wealth, and confidence, slowly transforming from distant provinces of an empire into a society with its own heart and identity. By the early 1700s, the map of English America was no longer a lonely settlement in the wilderness, but a chain of thriving colonies along the Atlantic coast. 13 in all, unique, each shaped by its geography, people, and purpose. They were bound together by language and law, yet divided by culture and ambition. Together, they formed a portrait of diversity that would become the foundation of a new nation. In the north, along the rocky coasts of New England, life was forged in hardship and faith. Towns like Boston, Salem, and Providence rose from forests and stone, built by hands hardened through labor and prayer. The soil was poor, but the spirit of the people was strong. They fished the icy waters of the Atlantic, built ships from towering pines, and traded with Europe, the Caribbean, and Africa. These northern colonies were shaped by religion, the legacy of the Puritans and Pilgrims who had come seeking a godly life. Their communities were tight-knit, their laws strict, their churches central to every aspect of life. Yet, even in their piety, they fostered learning and civic duty. Schools and universities were founded: Harvard in Massachusetts, Yale in Connecticut, ensuring that future generations could read both the Bible and the laws that governed them. In the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, the world was different. Fertile soil and deep rivers made these lands rich and open to opportunity. Here, merchants traded grain, fur, and timber, while craftsmen built the first great cities of the New World. New York, once a Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, became a bustling port filled with languages and faces from across Europe. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, was born not of conquest but of conscience. A Quaker and idealist, Penn dreamed of a land where tolerance, peace, and fairness would rule. His colony welcomed people of all faiths: Germans, Dutch, Swedes, Scots-Irish, bringing their traditions and trades. It became a haven of diversity and prosperity, proof that liberty could flourish without chaos. Further south, life unfolded under different stars. In Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia, the rhythm of life was slower but heavier, tied to the vast plantations that stretched across the land. Tobacco, rice, and indigo were the lifeblood of the southern economy, crops that demanded labor, endless and brutal labor. At first, that work was done by indentured servants, poor Europeans who traded years of toil for passage to America. But as demand grew and laborers dwindled, plantation owners turned to a crueler system. Ships began arriving from Africa, carrying men, women, and children in chains. By the early 1700s, the enslavement of Africans had become central to the southern colonies, turning fields of wealth into monuments of suffering. From this contradiction, freedom for some, bondage for others, the American identity began to take shape. The colonies saw themselves as builders of a new world, yet their prosperity rested on the old world's cruelties. Even as they preached liberty, they practiced oppression. And though the reckoning was far away, the seed of that moral struggle was already planted deep in their soil. Across all 13 colonies, a shared sense of independence was growing quietly, almost unconsciously. The Atlantic Ocean, once a barrier, had become a bridge of trade and ideas. Ships carried not only goods, but newspapers, letters, and books. Colonists began to see themselves as part of something larger, not just subjects of a distant king, but participants in a vibrant, expanding civilization. Life in the colonies was shaped by work, faith, and community. In small towns, the church bell marked the rhythm of every day. In cities like Boston and Philadelphia, taverns buzzed with conversation, news from London, gossip from neighbors, debates over politics and trade. The colonies were alive with energy, and in that energy, a new kind of society was being born. Education and literacy spread. More people could read than in most parts of Europe. Printing presses flourished, producing pamphlets and papers that carried both sermons and satire. Men like Benjamin Franklin rose from humble beginnings to become printers, inventors, and philosophers, embodying the belief that talent and hard work, not birthright, determined worth. Franklin's life was the story of America in miniature, ambitious, restless, and endlessly curious. The religious landscape of the colonies was as varied as their geography. In New England, Puritanism still reigned, but was slowly softening. In the Middle Colonies, Quakers, Lutherans, and Mennonites worshipped side by side. In the South, Anglican planters prayed in grand churches, while enslaved Africans carried with them songs and spirituals that blended faith with sorrow and hope. By the 1730s, a wave of revival known as the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield thundered from pulpits and open fields, calling people to repentance and rebirth. The movement broke the old hierarchies of faith. Farmers, women, and even the enslaved felt the stirring of spiritual equality. It was religion democratized, faith unbound from formality. The Great Awakening did more than fill churches. It awakened the spirit of individuality and moral conscience. For the first time, ordinary people began to question authority, not just in religion but in all of life. They started to believe that they had the right to interpret truth for themselves. That same fire would soon ignite the struggle for independence. The colonies were not united by design, but by circumstance. Each had its own governor, its own assembly, its own way of life. Yet all were bound by the invisible threads of commerce and survival. The Navigation Acts of the British Crown tried to keep them loyal laws, requiring that colonial goods be shipped only on English vessels, traded only through English ports. The empire prospered, but the colonists chafed under control. Smuggling became common, and resentment began to simmer beneath the surface of obedience. Despite their differences, the colonies began to resemble a single organism, a network of towns and ports, fields and markets, linked by roads, rivers, and shared experience. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses passed laws that shaped daily life. In Massachusetts, town meetings became forums for democracy. In Pennsylvania, tolerance became policy. Everywhere, the people were learning how to govern themselves. The diversity of the colonies was their strength. New England stood for faith and learning. The Middle Colonies for trade and tolerance. The Southern Colonies for agriculture and ambition. Each contributed a piece of what would one day be called the American spirit, industrious, independent, and unafraid. By the mid-1700s, the population of the 13 colonies had exploded to more than 2 million. Cities like Philadelphia became centers of art, science, and politics. Printing presses, workshops, and docks bustled with energy. There was poverty, yes, and inequality. But there was also opportunity on a scale unseen in Europe. A man could rise by his merit, not his birth. This freedom, quiet, practical, and imperfect, was the colony's greatest inheritance. It was not written into law, but lived in habit. The people governed themselves because no one else could. They traded, worshipped, and learned as they pleased because the distance from England made enforcement impossible. Over time, that distance became not just physical, but mental. The colonies were England's in name, but America's in spirit. The French and Indian War would soon change everything, binding and breaking the colonies at once. But before that storm, there was peace, a century of growth, of creation, of contradiction. The land was rich, the future limitless. The children born in Boston, New York, and Charleston no longer saw themselves as Englishmen abroad. They were something different now, something new. They had tilled foreign soil until it became home. They had worshipped in freedom until it became instinct. They had argued in town halls and traded in open markets until self-government became a habit of the heart. They were no longer colonies waiting for approval. They were a people becoming a nation. From the forests of Maine to the rice fields of Georgia, from Quaker halls to Puritan churches, from humble farms to crowded ports, the 13 colonies had become a living experiment in diversity and endurance. They were bound together by contradictions, slavery and liberty, faith and greed, unity and division. But through those contradictions, they had learned the most important lesson of all, that identity is not given by kings, but forged by people. The world still called them subjects of the British Crown, but history was already calling them something else, Americans. And as they looked westward across the mountains and eastward across the ocean, they began to feel the first whispers of destiny. A whisper that said, "This land, this life, this freedom belongs to us now." The story of America's colonies was not written only in faith and courage, but in trade, profit, and power. Behind every sermon and settlement, behind every ship and field, there was an empire counting its coins. The dream of the New World was never just spiritual, it was economic. And the heartbeat of that economy was England's hunger for wealth, dominance, and control. When the first settlers crossed the Atlantic, they carried not only the Bible, but ledgers. They came with royal charters and promises of profit. Jamestown, Plymouth, Charleston, Boston was born as much from commerce as from conviction. For the merchants of London, the New World was not a frontier of faith, but a business venture. By the mid-1600s, the English Empire had learned how to turn colonies into engines of prosperity. Across the Atlantic, silver and sugar were pouring into Spanish ports, enriching Madrid and funding cathedrals. France ruled the fur trade in the north, sending beaver pelts to Paris to make hats for kings. England, late to empire, needed its own treasure, and it found it not in gold mines, but in people-lit colonists. The system that governed these faraway settlements was called mercantilism. It was a simple but ruthless equation. Colonies existed to enrich the mother country. They supplied raw materials, timber, tobacco, cotton, fish and, in return, they were expected to buy manufactured goods from England alone. It was an empire of trade, not trust. The crown saw the colonies as a vast workshop of labor and land. Everything that grew, that was mined, that was built, ultimately served the island across the sea. Trade routes formed like veins across the ocean. Ships carried sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from Virginia, and furs from New England, returning with cloth, tools, and tea. The Atlantic became not a barrier, but a marketplace, and the colonists, its merchants and servants. To protect this system, Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts. Beginning in the 1650s, these laws declared that only English ships could carry goods to and from English colonies, and that certain valuable exports like tobacco, sugar, and cotton could be sold only to England. The empire wanted no leaks in its economy. Every coin, every cargo, had to pass through British hands. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, it was rebellion waiting to happen. Colonial merchants, clever, ambitious, and increasingly independent, found ways around the rules. Smuggling became an art. In the quiet coves of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, ships slipped out at night, carrying barrels of rum to the Caribbean or cloth to French islands in exchange for molasses. The British Navy patrolled the seas, but the coastline was too long, the colonists too resourceful. Despite the restrictions, prosperity bloomed. By 1700, the colonies had become vital to the empire's wealth. Virginia's tobacco fields stretched for miles, their sweet leaves feeding London's addiction. New England's shipyards thundered with hammers, building vessels faster and cheaper than any in Europe. Pennsylvania's grain fed the Caribbean plantations, and Charleston's ports overflowed with rice, indigo, and enslaved labor. The colonies were growing rich but not free. Every act of trade reminded them that their success was borrowed, their economy chained to London's will. Yet even as they obeyed, they learned. They learned the art of business, of negotiation, of managing their own affairs. Each transaction was a lesson in independence disguised as loyalty. For the ordinary colonist, life revolved around the rhythms of this imperial economy. In the north, fishermen rose before dawn to cast their nets into the cold Atlantic, their catch salted and shipped to Europe. Farmers in the middle colonies harvested wheat that would be baked into bread for London's tables. In the south, enslaved Africans worked from sunrise to sunset under the lash, their labor feeding an empire that denied them humanity. This, too, was the economics of empire, the dark side of prosperity. The system thrived on inequality. For every merchant who grew rich, there were hundreds who toiled in fields or sweatshops, unseen and unfree. The wealth of England and its colonies was built upon the suffering of others, the indentured servant. The sailor lost at sea, the enslaved man and woman, whose bodies became commodities. In the Caribbean, the triangular trade took shape, a cruel but efficient circuit that linked 3 continents. European ships carried manufactured goods to Africa, where they were exchanged for captives. Those captives were transported across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, a voyage so horrific that millions perished before reaching land. Those who survived were sold in the Americas, their labor producing sugar, tobacco, and rum goods that sailed back to Europe to begin the cycle again. The colonies were not just participants in this system, they were essential to it. New England distilleries turned Caribbean molasses into rum, which was then traded for more enslaved Africans. Southern plantations expanded, feeding Europe's appetite for luxury. It was a network of profit and pain that connected Boston to Barbados, London to Lagos. And yet, within this web of commerce, something unexpected began to grow, a sense of capability. The colonists became experts in trade, in negotiation, in production. They built ships, minted coins, and created local markets that functioned with little help from London. They were no longer helpless settlers. They were entrepreneurs, craftsmen, financiers, citizens, in all but name. The wealth of the colonies created new classes and new tensions. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, a merchant elite rose educated, refined, and ambitious. They imported silks, books, and fine china, seeking to live like English gentlemen. Beneath them were artisans and laborers, men and women who worked with their hands, who built the furniture, baked the bread, and printed the papers that filled the streets with life. In the countryside, farmers and planters built their own small kingdoms. Land was the true measure of power, and in the vastness of America, it seemed endless. But as populations grew and borders pushed westward, conflict with native tribes intensified. Expansion, driven by economic hunger, became inevitable and violent. Even religion, once the foundation of settlement, began to intertwine with trade. Churches collected tithes in coin, not crops. Ministers preached about morality, but also thrift, hard work, and success, the seeds of a capitalist spirit that would one day define the nation. Prosperity became both a blessing and a burden, proof of divine favor and a reminder of moral compromise. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were richer and more confident than ever. Their ships crossed every ocean, their goods filled every market. In the grand houses of planters and merchants, imported tea was poured into porcelain cups, and English newspapers discussed politics an ocean away. Yet the distance between the colonies and the crown was more than miles. It was becoming an emotional and intellectual chasm. The colonies had learned to live without constant guidance. They governed themselves through assemblies and town meetings, collected their own taxes, and defended their own borders. England's hand, though still heavy, felt distant. And as wealth increased, so did pride. A generation had been born in America, raised in freedom and self-reliance. They owed loyalty to the king, but their hearts belonged to their land. Still, Britain viewed the colonies as children, useful, but subordinate. London dictated trade, prices, and policy with little regard for colonial voices. When merchants complained of taxes or restrictions, they were reminded that the empire had protected them, that prosperity came with obedience. But the colonists had begun to see a different truth, that they were the empire's strength, not its servants. This growing confidence, this quiet defiance, was invisible to the British Parliament. To London, America was a success story, proof of the system's perfection. But beneath the surface, discontent was spreading like fire beneath ash. The same trade routes that carried sugar and tobacco also carried ideas, pamphlets about liberty, essays on self-rule, whispers of Enlightenment philosophy. Thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu had written that government existed only by consent of the governed. These words crossed the Atlantic, printed in colonial newspapers, and debated in taverns. Merchants and farmers alike began to ask, if we can build, trade, and thrive on our own, why do we need an empire at all? The irony was cruel. The more successful the colonies became, the less they needed Britain. Prosperity, meant to bind them to the crown, was setting them free. And then came war, the French and Indian War, fought between 1754 and 1763. It was a global conflict that would forever change the balance between colony and crown. The British emerged victorious, but burdened with enormous debt. To pay for their triumph, Parliament turned once again to the colonies. New taxes, new restrictions, new controls. The merchants who had once prospered under empire now found themselves strangled by it. The farmers who had fed the world began to resent the hand that took their grain. And the same men who had built the wealth of the British Empire began to dream of another kind of economy, one not dictated by kings and merchants, but by the will of free men. This was the great paradox of the empire. In enriching the colonies, it had created the very forces that would one day destroy it. The economics of empire had built America's foundations, the ports, the plantations, the markets, the ships, but it had also built the spirit that would tear those foundations from imperial control. The desire for profit had sown the desire for power. The freedom to trade had awakened the hunger to govern. When the revolution finally came, it was not only a rebellion of soldiers, but of merchants, farmers, and craftsmen. It was the ultimate transaction, the exchange of empire for independence. The story of the colony's economy was, at its heart, the story of humanity itself, ambition, greed, creativity, and contradiction. It was a reminder that wealth can build empires, but it can also unmake them. For in the end, the colonies did not simply trade goods, they traded identities. They became something England could never fully own: self-made, self-taught, and soon enough, self-governed. And as their ships sailed across the Atlantic, carrying tobacco, sugar, and dreams, one truth became clear. The greatest product of the American colonies was not wealth, it was freedom. In the quiet rooms of Europe's great cities, as candles flickered and printing presses hummed, a revolution of thought began, one that would reach across oceans and reshape the very soul of humanity. The 17th and 18th centuries came to be known as the Age of Enlightenment, an age when reason challenged tradition, and knowledge dared to confront power. Kings ruled by divine right. Empires spanned continents. The Church claimed to speak for God. Yet in the minds of philosophers, scientists, and dreamers, a dangerous question began to form. What if truth did not belong to kings and priests, but to every man? This question traveled on ships, in books, and in whispers, crossing the Atlantic to the distant American colonies, where it found a people already accustomed to thinking for themselves. The Enlightenment was born from curiosity. In London, Paris, and Amsterdam, men like Isaac Newton, John Locke, Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau studied nature, society, and the human soul. They believed that reason was the light that could guide civilization out of darkness. The universe, they said, was not chaos ruled by mystery, but order ruled by laws. If one could understand those laws, then one could understand both nature and man. Locke wrote of natural rights, life, liberty, and Propertan declared that governments existed only by the consent of the governed. Montesquieu argued that power must be divided, lest it become tyranny. Rousseau proclaimed that man was born free, but was everywhere in chains. These ideas spread like wildfire among the educated, carried by pamphlets and letters, by lectures and conversation. In the colonies of North America, far from the courts of kings, these ideas found fertile soil. Here, men and women lived without the constant gaze of monarchy. They tilled their own land, governed their own towns, and worshipped as they pleased. Life in the New World was harsh, but it demanded independence. And from independence grew intellect. In Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg, a new class of thinkers was emerging: merchants, preachers, teachers, and writersmen who read Locke and Newton, who studied science and politics by candlelight after a day's labor. They were not aristocrats. They were citizens. The Enlightenment taught them to see themselves not as subjects of empire, but as participants in the grand order of creation. Science, too, became a form of worship. To understand the world was to glorify God through reason. Colonial thinkers mapped the stars, studied electricity, and experimented with crops and medicine. None embodied this spirit more than Benjamin Franklin, a man of endless curiosity. Printer, scientist, philosopher, and diplomat, Franklin personified the new American mind: practical, rational, and restless. He built lightning rods to tame storms, libraries to spread knowledge, and philosophical societies where ideas flowed as freely as the ale. His experiments with electricity revealed that nature itself could be understood through observation and logic, not superstition. Franklin's belief that knowledge should serve humanity became a guiding principle of the American spirit. But the Enlightenment in the colonies was not confined to science, and philosophy had transformed religion. The Puritan world of strict doctrine was giving way to something more personal, more inward. The Great Awakening, a wave of spiritual revival that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, brought emotion to faith, but it also awakened reason. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield spoke not only of salvation but of individual conscience. They urged people to seek truth within themselves, to question empty rituals and authority. This combination, rational enlightenment and emotional awakening, created a uniquely American character. The colonists learned to think freely and feel deeply, to balance logic with conviction. They believed that moral truth could be found in both the mind and the heart. The printing press became the engine of revolution. In taverns and meeting houses, newspapers and pamphlets circulated news, arguments, and ideas. Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, among others, published essays on science, politics, and virtue. Ordinary people, farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants discussed them as equals. The colonies were becoming a nation of readers and reasoners. Education flourished. Colleges multiplied not just to train ministers, but to cultivate thinkers. Books that once could be read only by scholars now filled the shelves of common men. Enlightenment philosophy blended with Puritan literacy and frontier pragmatism to create a society where knowledge was both weapon and shield. As generations passed, The colonial mind began to change in quiet but profound ways. Where once the settlers had seen themselves as servants of empire, now they saw themselves as capable of shaping destiny. They began to believe that the world was not fixed, but could be improved, that governments could be built, laws rewritten, societies reborn. The Enlightenment taught them that human beings were not bound by tradition alone. They were endowed with reason, capable of progress. This belief was radical, revolutionary, and deeply American. Even the structure of colonial government began to reflect these ideals. In assemblies and town meetings, men debated laws and taxes. They learned how to argue respectfully, how to persuade, how to compromise. They were practicing democracy long before it had a name. The Enlightenment also reshaped how the colonists viewed themselves in the grand design of empire. They began to question why decisions made in distant London should determine their lives. If reason was universal, then wisdom was not the property of kings. The colonists believed they were just as capable of understanding justice and governing society as any noble across the sea. In their universities and drawing rooms, they discussed Locke's idea that government was a contract, not a birthright. A contract could be broken if one side failed to honor it. If the crown taxed them without representation, restricted their trade, or dismissed their assemblies, then perhaps the contract itself was void. But the Enlightenment also carried attention a belief in human perfectibility that often ignored its own contradictions. The same thinkers who wrote of liberty and equality lived in societies built on slavery and exclusion. Even Franklin, though he would later oppose it, benefited from the economy of bondage. The colonists' pursuit of freedom coexisted uneasily with their acceptance of injustice. This paradox would haunt America for centuries, but in those early days, it was not hypocrisy it was hierarchy. They believed that enlightenment would come in stages, that some were ready for liberty while others were not. It was an imperfect vision of a perfect idea. Still, the power of thought was unstoppable. In New England, sermons began to blend theology with philosophy. Ministers quoted Locke alongside scripture. In the South, planters debated Montesquieu's theories of government even as they profited from human bondage. Across the colonies, a new vocabulary emerged: rights, liberty, progress, reason, words that would one day form the grammar of revolution. By the 1750s, the colonies were no longer isolated outposts, they were part of a global conversation. Ships brought not only goods but books and ideas. The same currents that carried tea and tobacco also carried the spirit of reform. The Enlightenment was not a European phenomenon anymore, it had become Atlantic. And in the American colonies, it took on a life of its own. It became less about aristocratic salons, and more about town halls and common sense. Less about philosophers, and more about farmers who believed that all men were capable of thought. The Enlightenment in America was not merely read, was lived. Science and self-government became two sides of the same coin. Just as nature operated by laws discoverable through reason, so too could society be governed by laws made by men. If gravity could be measured, then justice could be defined. If the stars obeyed order, so could nations. The colonists began to see themselves as part of that cosmic harmony, creators, not subjects. Franklin once wrote, "God helps those who help themselves." It was more than a proverb, was the philosophy of an entire people. To act, to think, to create, these were sacred duties. The divine and the rationale were no longer enemies, but partners in progress. By the 1760s, this intellectual confidence was unmistakable. A generation of colonists had been raised not to kneel before authority, but to question it. When Parliament passed new taxes and laws, it was not just a matter of money, it was a matter of principle. The colonists had been educated in the language of liberty. They would not easily forget it. They began to quote the philosophers they once studied. Locke's call for consent, Montesquieu's warning against tyranny, Rousseau's dream of social contracts. The Enlightenment had armed them not with weapons, but with words, and words, once spoken, could not be silenced. When the cry of no taxation without representation first echoed in colonial streets, it was not a simple protest. It was the culmination of a century of ideas. It was the Enlightenment, reborn in American voices. The belief that reason, not rank, should govern men. That knowledge, not nobility, should define worth. That freedom, not fear, was the natural state of humankind. The Age of Enlightenment had begun as an intellectual revolution in Europe, but in America, it became something greater, moral one. The colonists were not merely students of philosophy. They were its living proof. In time, Their minds would give birth to a declaration that changed the world. But long before the ink dried on parchment in Philadelphia, the real revolution had already begun in the hearts and minds of a people who dared to think differently. They had learned from the philosophers that ideas were stronger than empires, that governments could rise and fall, but truth, once known, could not be unlearned. And so, as the Enlightenment's light spread across the 13 colonies, it illuminated not just books and lecture halls, but every workshop, every church, every farm. It turned subjects into citizens, and citizens into visionaries. It was not a revolution of muskets and banners, but of minds and hearts. The dawn of reason in the New World. And from that dawn would come a new sun, one that would rise not just over America, but over all of humanity. Long before the American Revolution, before the cries for liberty echoed across the colonies, another conflict had already begun to shape their destiny. It was not a war for independence, but it would make independence inevitable. It was the French and Indian War, a clash of empires, of cultures, and of visions for a continent. Between 1754 and 1763, the forests and frontiers of North America became the stage where the world's greatest powers, Britain and France, fought for control of the New World. And in the shadows of that struggle, the American identity was born. For more than a century, the two empires had lived side by side on the North American continent. France ruled vast territories stretching from Canada down the Mississippi River to Louisiana. Britain held the Atlantic coast, from the rocky shores of Maine to the rice fields of Georgia. Between them lay the wilderness, a land of rivers, mountains, and tribes. Both powers claimed it, neither would share it. The spark came in the distant Ohio Valley, a region of rich land and strategic importance. There, French soldiers began building forts to secure their claim, linking their northern and southern colonies. British settlers, hungry for land and profit, pushed westward, ignoring treaties and borders. Conflict was inevitable. In 1754, a young Virginia officer named George Washington, only 22 years old, was sent to warn the French to leave British-claimed territory. They refused. Soon after, Washington led a small band of soldiers to attack a French scouting party. Shots were fired in the forest near Fort Duquesne, and a French officer was killed. The encounter was small, but its echo was enormous. The blood spilled in that forest ignited a war that would engulf continents. The French responded swiftly. They surrounded Washington's small fort, Fort Necessity, and forced him to surrender. Humiliated, he returned home unaware that he had just fired the first shot of a global conflict. By 1756, the fighting in North America had spread to Europe, the Caribbean, and Asia. It became known as the 7 Years' War, the first truly global war in history. Yet in America, it remained the French and Indian War, named for the alliances that defined it. The French fought alongside powerful indigenous nations, the Huron, Algonquin, and others, while the British aligned with the Iroquois Confederacy and their own colonial militias. For the native peoples, it was not merely a European war. It was a struggle for their land, their trade, and their survival. They fought bravely and strategically, shifting alliances as needed to protect their own interests. They were not pawns. They were powers in their own right. But as the war dragged on, they too would pay a heavy price. At first, the war went badly for the British. Their generals, strained in European battlefields, struggled to fight in the dense forests of America. In 1755, General Edward Braddock led a large army to capture Fort Duquesne. Among his aides was George Washington, once again facing the French. But the expedition was ambushed. Musket fire erupted from the trees. Braddock was killed, his army shattered. Washington rallied survivors through chaos and smoke, his calm under fire earning him a legend that would follow him forever. The early years of the war were a series of defeats and frustrations. British forts fell. French forces, supported by native allies, struck deep into frontier settlements, burning homes and seizing captives. Panic spread across the colonies. But from defeat came adaptation. The colonists learned to fight not as soldiers of empire, but as men of the wilderness. They formed militias, built defenses, and relied on their own strength. Slowly, an American way of war began to emerge, resourceful, resilient, unyielding. By 1757, Britain's leadership changed, and so did the war. Under William Pitt, a new strategy took shape. Pitt saw North America not as a sideshow, but as the key to empire. He poured money, troops, and ships into the colonies, determined to crush France once and for all. The tide began to turn. British forces launched coordinated attacks along the frontier. In 1758, they captured Louisbourg, the gateway to Canada. That same year, they took Fort Duquesne, renaming it Fort Pittsburgh, future city of Pittsburgh. The name still bears the memory of victory. The war's decisive moment came in 1759, at the Battle of Quebec. On a foggy night, British General James Wolfe led his troops up the cliffs overlooking the city. The French, commanded by Marquis de Montcalm, were caught off guard. As dawn broke, musket fire thundered across the plains of Abraham. Both commanders were mortally wounded, but the British emerged victorious. With Quebec captured, French power in North America was doomed. By 1763, the war was over. The Treaty of Paris redrew the map of the world. France surrendered nearly all of its North American possessions. Canada became British. The lands east of the Mississippi fell under British rule. Spain, France's ally, ceded Florida to Britain, but gained the vast Louisiana territory in return. The dream of a French empire in America was gone. Britain now stood triumphant. Its flag flew from the Arctic to the Caribbean, its empire larger and richer than ever before. But victory came at a staggering cost. The war had nearly doubled Britain's debt. Maintaining troops across this vast new territory required money. The Crown believed the colonies should help pay. To London, it was only fair. The colonies had benefited from British protection. They should share the burden. But to the colonists, who had fought and died beside British regulars, the demand felt like betrayal. They had shed blood for the empire. Was that not payment enough? The war had changed them. It had shown them their own strength. Colonial militias had fought bravely, sometimes more effectively than British troops. They had defended their homes, built their own supplies, and organized their own leadership. They no longer saw themselves as helpless subjects. They had learned to trust themselves, to depend on their own courage and coordination. The seeds of independence were being sown not in words, but in war. The war also revealed the arrogance of empire. British officers often looked down on their colonial counterparts, treating them as inferior. Washington himself experienced this firsthand, denied a royal commission despite his service. The message was clear. In the eyes of Britain, the colonists were useful but unequal. That wound would never fully heal. Meanwhile, on the frontier, the indigenous nations who had fought beside France faced devastation. With French power gone, there was no balance left to restrain British expansion. Settlers poured westward into native lands, violating promises and sparking new conflicts. In 1763, a great uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion swept through the Ohio Valley, as tribes resisted British encroachment. Villages burned, forts fell, and the old alliances crumbled. To restore order, the British Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. It was meant to prevent further bloodshed, but it enraged the settlers. They saw it as an attempt to cage their ambition, to confine them within borders drawn by distant hands. After fighting and dying for the land, they were told they could not claim it. The war had united Britain and its colonies in victory, but the peace would divide them. As the soldiers returned home, the economic strain of empire deepened. Britain imposed new taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and others to recover its costs. To London, these were practical measures. To the colonists, they were tyranny. The same people who had cheered the British flag now began to question it. The empire that had once protected them now seemed to exploit them. The French and Indian War had redrawn more than maps, it had redrawn minds. It had turned subjects into skeptics, colonists into critics, and loyalty into doubt. It was the war that taught the colonies their own power and exposed the empire's weakness. Even George Washington, once a proud officer of the king, began to see the shape of things to come. The experience of battle, the arrogance of command, the unequal treatment, all of it planted in him a quiet, growing conviction that no people should serve a government that refused to see them as equals. In the end, the French and Indian War was more than a conflict between empires. It was a crucible in which a nation was forged. It was the first time the 13 colonies acted together, fought together, and discovered that together they could stand. The forests that once echoed with musket fire would one day echo with a different cry, the cry of revolution. For though the war ended in Britain's triumph, its true victory belonged to the colonies. In the ashes of battle, they had found their identity, and in the arrogance of empire, they had glimpsed their destiny. What began as a struggle for territory ended as a turning point for freedom. The empire had won the war, but in doing so, it had lost its colonies. By the mid-1700s, the colonies of North America were thriving. From the shipyards of Boston to the plantations of Virginia, from the merchant docks of New York to the farmlands of Pennsylvania, A new world had taken shape, ambitious and self-reliant. The people of the 13 colonies had built their lives from nothing, carving homes and futures out of wilderness. They saw themselves as loyal subjects of the British Crown, proud of their English heritage, but increasingly aware that they were something different, something new. The French and Indian War had ended in victory, but it had also revealed a truth the empire could not unsee. The colonies were capable of standing on their own. Britain's victory was vast, but so was its debt. The war had been costly, millions of pounds spent defending the colonies, and now someone had to pay. To the British Parliament, the solution was simple. The colonies had benefited from the war. Now they would help bear its cost. But to the colonists, the logic was anything but simple. They had fought beside British soldiers, buried their dead in the same soil, and shed blood for the empire. They had not been consulted about the war's start, nor its end. And now they were to be taxed by a government 3,000 miles away, a government where they had no voice. The stage was set for confrontation, not of armies, but of principles. The first sign of tension came in 1764 with the Sugar Act, a tax on imported goods like sugar and molasses. It was soon followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which required that every legal document, newspaper, and pamphlet carry a government-issued stamp. It was not just a tax, it was a declaration of control. For the first time, Parliament had imposed a direct tax on the colonies without their consent. The response was swift and furious. Across the colonies, protests erupted. Merchants refused to buy British goods. Printers published essays condemning the law. The cry spread from town to town. No taxation without representation. It was not merely a slogan, it was a moral stance. A rejection of tyranny cloaked in legality. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry stood before the House of Burgesses and declared, "If this be treason, make the most of it." In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams organized resistance, forming the Sons of Liberty, a secret society dedicated to opposing British policies through protests, persuasion, and sometimes force. In taverns and meeting houses, ordinary colonists, farmers, shopkeepers, apprentices gathered to discuss their rights. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 brought delegates from 9 colonies together in New York, the first unified political action of the colonies against the crown. They petitioned the king, asserting their loyalty, but demanding the repeal of unjust laws. Britain was stunned by their boldness, but the pressure worked. The Stamp Act was repealed. The colonists celebrated their victory, but the joy was short-lived. Parliament quickly passed the Declaratory Act, asserting that it had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The empire would not yield. New taxes followed the Townshend Acts of 1767, placing duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. Customs officers were sent to enforce them, backed by the British Navy. The ports of Boston and New York bristled with soldiers. The sight of redcoats on colonial streets became a daily reminder that freedom was slipping away. Tensions exploded in 1770 on a cold March night in Boston. A crowd gathered around British soldiers, cheering and throwing snowballs packed with ice and stone. The soldiers panicked. Muskets fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. The incident was quickly branded the Boston Massacre. The engravings spread through the colonies like wildfire, images of innocent men gunned down by imperial power. The word massacre became a rallying cry. Still, the colonies hesitated to break. They were angry but not yet united in revolution. The majority still considered themselves loyal Englishmen, demanding rights, not rebellion. But beneath that loyalty, something irreversible was forming, a shared identity, built not on empire, but on justice. In 1773, Parliament made one final, fateful mistake. The Tea Act granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. It was a clever trap. The tea was actually cheaper, but the tax remained, forcing colonists to acknowledge Parliament's authority. The Crown believed it had outsmarted them. It had not. On a December night in Boston, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships docked in the harbor. They worked silently and quickly, breaking open chests of tea and dumping them into the icy water. As dawn broke, the harbor was stained brown with defiance. It was the Boston Tea Party, an act of rebellion that electrified the world. Britain's response was ruthless. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts, punishing Massachusetts by closing the port of Boston, dissolving its local government, and placing it under military rule. British General Thomas Gage was appointed governor, backed by thousands of troops. To the empire, it was a show of strength. To the colonies, it was the final insult. For the first time, all 13 colonies began to see themselves not as separate provinces, but as one people under threat. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. It was a meeting of mines lawyers, merchants, farmers, and philosophers determined to find a peaceful resolution. Among them were George Washington, John Adams, and Patrick Henry. They declared their loyalty to the king but demanded that Parliament withdraw its troops and repeal its oppressive laws. They agreed to boycott British goods and prepare for possible conflict. Patrick Henry's words captured the moment. "I am not a Virginian, but an American." The Empire ignored them. In the early hours of April 19, 1775, British troops marched from Boston toward the town of Concord to seize colonial weapons. Along the road, they were met by local militia's ordinary farmers, known as Minutemen. At Lexington, the two sides faced each other in tense silence. Then, a single shot rang out. No one knew who fired it, but history would remember it as the shot heard round the world. The British advanced, but the countryside erupted. Bells rang, riders galloped, and militias swarmed from every direction. The redcoats were forced to retreat under constant fire. The people had risen. The war had begun. Across the colonies, the news spread like wildfire. From New England to the Carolinas, men took up arms, blacksmiths forged muskets, and families prepared for war. What had begun as resistance had become revolution. The following month, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Debate raged between moderates, who still hoped for reconciliation, and radicals, who demanded independence. But events were moving faster than words. On June 15, 1775, the Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a Virginian leading men from Massachusetts, symbol of a unity no king could undo. That same summer, the first great battle was fought at Bunker Hill, outside Boston. The British charged 3 times up the hill, facing deadly colonial fire. They took the ground, but at a terrible cost, over 1,000 soldiers dead or wounded. The colonists had proven they could stand against the Empire's might. Even as blood was shed, the colonists sent one last appeal to King George III, the olive branch petition pleading for peace. The king refused to read it. Instead, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. The door to reconciliation slammed shut forever. In the months that followed, the spirit of resistance turned into a vision of freedom. Pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense ignited the hearts of millions. Paine wrote, not as a scholar, but as a man speaking to his brothers. "'Tis time to part." His words cut through fear and tradition. He called the monarchy a relic of tyranny, urging the colonies to claim their destiny as free and independent states. In taverns and town halls, people read his words aloud, cheering, weeping, believing. What had once seemed unthinkable was now inevitable. Independence was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. By the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress reconvened, ready to make history. A committee was chosen to draft a formal declaration. The task fell largely to a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, whose pen would capture the dreams of an entire people. His words were simple, but eternal. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." On July 4, 1776, in the city of Philadelphia, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and cannons fired in celebration. But behind the joy lay the weight of consequence. The signers knew that they had just committed treason against the most powerful empire on earth. They had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to a cause that had no guarantee of success. The world watched, unbelieving. A handful of colonies, scattered along a distant coast, had defied a king and declared themselves free. It was madness and it was magnificent. The age of resistance had ended. The age of revolution had begun. No longer would Americans bow to distant rulers or pay taxes to unseen lords. No longer would they define themselves as subjects of empire. They were a people reborn, their nation baptized, not in ceremony, but in courage. The road ahead would be long and brutal years of war, sacrifice, and uncertainty, but the choice had been made. Freedom was no longer a privilege granted by kings. It was a right claimed by men. And as the ink dried on the declaration, one truth burned brighter than all others. The spirit of resistance had become the soul of America. Before the smoke of revolution filled the skies of America, there was silence. The kind of silence that comes before a storm, the stillness of a nation holding its breath. For years, the colonies had resisted with petitions, boycotts, and words. But now, words were no longer enough. The Empire had ignored their pleas, tightened its grip, and called their defiance treason. The British Crown was determined to restore order. The colonies were ready to defend their liberty. And on a cold April morning, in 1775, the first shots of a new world were fired. Tensions had reached their breaking point. The British government had declared Massachusetts to be in open rebellion. General Thomas Gage, the military governor in Boston, commanded thousands of British troops redcoats stationed throughout the city. To the colonists, they were not soldiers but occupiers. Each march through Boston's narrow streets, each musket glinting in the sun, reminded them that freedom was slipping away. Across the countryside, militias prepared in secret. Farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, ordinary men trained by night, and swore to defend their towns at a moment's notice. They called themselves Minutemen. Their weapons were old, their supplies scarce, but their resolve was absolute. On the night of April 18, 1775, General Gage received intelligence that the colonists had hidden supplies of gunpowder, ammunition, and weapons in the town of Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. He also learned that two leading patriots, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, were hiding in nearby Lexington. Gage decided to act swiftly. He ordered a secret expedition of 700 soldiers to march under the cover of darkness, seize the weapons, and arrest the rebel leaders. But in a land already alive with rumor and resistance, there were no secrets left. As the redcoats prepared to march, patriots within Boston learned of the plan. One of them, Paul Revere, a silversmith and member of the Sons of Liberty, was ready. He and two other riders, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, mounted their horses and set off into the night. As Revere rode through the dark countryside, he shouted a warning that would echo through history. The British are coming. Lanterns glowed in windows, bells rang from steeples, and drums beat through sleeping villages. The countryside awoke. Farmers grabbed their muskets and powder horns. Women and children prayed, and men took to the roads. The revolution had begun before a single shot was fired. By dawn on April 19th, the British troops reached Lexington Green, a small field in the center of town. There, standing in the pale morning light, were about 70 Minutemen farmers, not soldiers led by Captain John Parker. He knew his men were outnumbered 10-1, but he refused to flee. He simply told them, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The redcoats advanced in formation, their commander ordering the rebels to disperse. The Minutemen stood silently. The tension was unbearable. Then, somewhere in that cold morning air, a single shot rang out. No one knew who fired it, British soldier, colonial militiaman, or an accidental discharge, but that one bullet shattered the peace of an empire. The British line erupted in gunfire. The Minutemen scattered. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead, and 10 were wounded. The British cheered their victory and marched on toward Concord, unaware that the countryside around them was rising. At Concord, the British found few weapons. The colonists had hidden most of them. But as they began to burn supplies, plumes of smoke rose above the town. Local militias saw the flames and believed the British were torching homes. Enraged, they gathered by the hundreds at the North Bridge, just outside of town. There, they faced a small British detachment guarding the bridge. For the first time that day, the colonists took the offensive. They advanced, steady and silent. When British troops opened fire, the patriots fired back. The volley roared across the river, and British soldiers fell. The colonists surged forward, forcing the redcoats to retreat. In that moment, everything changed. The colonists had fired, not in protest, but in battle. The world's most powerful empire had been challenged by farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. As the British began their long march back to Boston, the war truly began. From every hill and farmhouse, Minutemen appeared. They fired from behind walls and trees, harassing the British line mile after mile. It was not organized warfare, it was survival, courage, and fury. The retreat turned into a nightmare. Exhausted and bloodied, the redcoats fought their way through ambush after ambush. Nearly 300 British soldiers were killed or wounded before they reached the safety of Boston. When word of the battle spread, it raced through the colonies like lightning. In New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, church bells rang, militias mobilized, and newspapers proclaimed the news. The war has begun. For years, the colonists had called themselves loyal subjects. Now they were soldiers in a revolution. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, thousands of militiamen surrounded Boston, cutting off the British army inside. Farmers dropped their plows, apprentices left their shops, and men from every colony joined the siege. The city became a fortress, and the rebellion became a movement. Inside Boston, General Gage fortified his defenses and waited for reinforcements. The king's army was trapped by its own empire. The colonies, once scattered and divided, were suddenly united by blood and purpose. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened again. The delegates, lawyers, merchants, farmers, thinkers knew that the time for petitions had passed. The question was no longer if there would be war, but how to fight it. George Washington was chosen to command the new Continental Army, a Virginian leading New Englanders, proof that the colonies were no longer just neighbors, but one people. As Washington rode north to take command, he passed through towns buzzing with energy and fear. Men trained in fields, women sewed uniforms, blacksmiths hammered weapons day and night. The people were not waiting for orders. They were already fighting for freedom. Meanwhile, in England, news of the fighting reached King George III. His reaction was swift and merciless. He declared the colonies to be an open rebellion and ordered more troops to crush them. The king no longer saw them as subjects demanding justice, but as enemies to be subdued. But the British had underestimated the spirit they faced. The men who had stood at Lexington and Concord were not fighting for territory or power, they were fighting for an idea. The idea that a people could govern themselves. That liberty was not granted by kings, but born within every human heart. The war that began that April morning would last 8 long years. It would see great victories and bitter defeats. It would divide families, destroy towns, and test the limits of courage. But from its first moment, from that first gunshot in the dawn mist, the course of history had changed. The revolution was not born in palaces or parliaments, but on a village green, where ordinary men stood their ground against an empire. They did not know what lay ahead. They did not know if they would win, but they knew that if they did not stand, freedom would die before it was ever born. Later, in reflecting on that day, Ralph Waldo Emerson would write, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. That shot born of courage, fear, and conviction, was more than the sound of muskets. It was the sound of a people claiming their destiny." The British had come to seize weapons and arrest leaders. They left having awakened a revolution. From that day forward, the struggle for America's soul had begun, not just a war for independence, but a war for identity, for the right to define what freedom truly means. The fields of Lexington and Concord became sacred ground, the birthplace of a nation's promise. And though centuries have passed, the echo of that first shot still rings, reminding the world that freedom is not given, it is fought for, defended, and earned. The summer of 1776 was heavy with heat and history. The air in Philadelphia hung thick with tension, as if the city itself could sense that the world was about to change. For more than a decade, the 13 colonies had protested, petitioned, and pleaded with the British crown. They had been ignored, mocked, and punished. Now, their patience was gone. The time for words had passed. The time for freedom had come. The Continental Congress convened inside the Pennsylvania State House, a brick building that would one day be called Independence Hall. 56 delegates from the colonies sat within, men of different backgrounds, faiths, and temperaments. Some were merchants, some lawyers, some farmers, but all were bound by a single question that no generation before them had dared to ask. Could a people break free from the might of an empire and create a nation based on liberty alone? The war had already begun. The battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and the siege of Boston had proven that the colonies could fight. But fighting was one thing, declaring independence was another. To do so meant treason, and treason meant death. For weeks, the Congress debated. Some delegates, like John Adams of Massachusetts, argued that freedom was inevitable. Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, feared that declaring independence would bring chaos and ruin. The room grew hot with argument. Outside, crowds gathered in the streets, demanding action. Then, on June 7, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose and spoke the words that would change everything. Resolved, that these united colonies are spate, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The room fell silent. The motion was seconded by John Adams and sent to committee. The Congress appointed 5 men to draft a formal declaration: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a tall, quiet Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was only 33 years old, but his mind burned with the ideals of the Enlightenment. He had read Locke and Rousseau, studied philosophy and science, and believed deeply that liberty was not a gift from kings, but a right from nature itself. He wrote quickly, almost feverishly, in his rented room on Market Street, his quill scratching into parchment late into the night. He began with words that would outlive empires. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were simple words, but revolutionary ones. Never before had a nation been founded not on ancestry, not on conquest, but on universal principles. Jefferson's draft accused the British king of tyranny, of imposing taxes without consent, dissolving legislatures, waging war against his own subjects. A prince, Jefferson wrote, whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant, is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. The committee edited his work, polishing its rhythm but preserving its spirit. Franklin, with his wit, softened sharp edges. Adams defended its boldness. On June 28, they presented the draft to Congress. The debate that followed was fierce. Some words were cut, some lines debated for hours. Delegates from the South insisted on removing Jefferson's condemnation of slavery, an omission that would haunt the nation for centuries. But the essence remained, that the colonies were not merely rebelling, they were proclaiming the birth of a new order in human history. On July 2, 1776, the Congress voted. 12 colonies approved the resolution. New York abstained. John Adams, exhausted but triumphant, wrote to his wife Abigail that night, "The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America." But the true moment would come 2 days later. On the morning of July 4th, the final version of the Declaration of Independence was approved. Jefferson's words, born in a rented room, were now the voice of a people. The delegates signed their names to a document that could cost them their lives. At the top stood John Hancock, President of the Congress, who wrote his signature in bold, sweeping letters, "But the king can read it without his spectacles," he said with a smile. Others followed, some trembling, some resolute. Each knew that they were signing their death warrant if the revolution failed. As the quills left the parchment, a silence filled the room. Outside, bells rang. The declaration was read aloud to the people for the first time in Independence Square. The crowd erupted in cheers. Church bells pealed, and cannon fire echoed through the streets. In that instant, the United States of America was born, not yet in reality, but in spirit. Copies of the Declaration spread quickly through the colonies. In Boston, New York, and Charleston, people gathered to hear it read aloud. Soldiers listened in camps, inspired by the words that gave meaning to their struggle. The document traveled across the ocean, shaking the foundations of monarchy itself. Kings and ministers read it with alarm. The age of divine rule was ending. The age of the people had begun. The Declaration was not merely a political document, it was a moral revolution. It redefined what it meant to be human. It declared that freedom was not a privilege of the few, but a birthright of all. It gave voice to the voiceless, and courage to the oppressed. But even as it was celebrated, its contradictions were clear. The same Congress that proclaimed all men equal tolerated slavery. The new nation's promise was imperfect, its vision incomplete. Yet within those words lay the seeds of every struggle for justice that would follow the abolition of slavery. Women's suffrage, civil rights. The Declaration became not just the beginning of a country, but the beginning of a dream. The war itself continued to rage. British ships filled the harbors. Armies marched, cities burned. But now, the colonists were no longer rebels, they were revolutionaries. They no longer fought for protest, but for nationhood. They were bound not by loyalty to a king, but by a common belief in liberty. News of the Declaration reached George Washington's army in New York. The soldiers gathered as it was read aloud. They stood in silence, their faces hardened by battle and hope. When the last words were spoken, we mutually pledged to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. A shout rose from the ranks. The men cheered, threw their hats into the air, and fired their muskets in salute. That night, the Declaration was posted across the city. Crowds tore down a statue of King George III, melting its lead into bullets. The revolution had found its purpose, but freedom came at a terrible price. In the months that followed, British forces launched a massive invasion. Washington's army was driven from New York, suffering defeat after defeat. The dream of independence seemed to waver. Yet, even in retreat, the spirit of July 4th burned within them. The words Jefferson wrote became their shield against despair. Through blizzards and battlefields, through hunger and doubt, the Declaration reminded them why they fought. It was their scripture of freedom, their promise to history. In London, King George dismissed the document as the work of traitors. But across Europe, philosophers and common people alike were captivated. They saw in America's rebellion a new model for humanity, government built not on power, but on principle. Years later, revolutions in France, Latin America, and beyond would echo Jefferson's words. The flame lit in Philadelphia would travel the world. For the men who signed the Declaration, the cost was immense. Some lost fortunes, some lost homes, some lost their lives, but none recanted. Thomas Jefferson would later write, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." In that summer of 1776, the patriots had watered it with their courage. As the years passed, the document aged, its ink fading, its parchment yellowing, yet its power never diminished. It became the moral compass of a nation constantly struggling to live up to its own ideals. Every generation would return to it, seeking guidance and renewal. The Declaration of Independence was not the end of a story, it was the beginning of one. A story of imperfect men striving toward perfect ideals. A story of a people daring to believe that freedom was not just for the privileged, but for everyone. In a world ruled by kings, they declared that the people themselves were sovereign. In an age of empires, they dared to imagine a republic. And in a time of darkness, they wrote words that still shine like stars. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence remains more than a document. It is a covenant, a promise between the past and the future, between sacrifice and hope. It reminds us that freedom is not a gift kept by the powerful, but a trust shared by all. And so, as we remember that July morning in Philadelphia, let us remember what those men risked, what they dreamed, and what they began. A nation founded not on bloodlines or crowns, but on belief in liberty, equality, and the eternal courage to stand against tyranny. For, on that day, in that hall, beneath the weight of destiny and danger, humanity took a step closer to itself, and the world has never been the same. The year was 1776, and the world had changed forever. The colonies that once bowed to a distant king now stood alone, declaring themselves free and independent. But words on parchment were only the beginning. Freedom was not yet won. It had to be fought for, defended, and defined. The birth of America was not a moment, it was a struggle. It was not a ceremony, it was a war. The Declaration of Independence had lit a fire that could no longer be contained. Across the colonies, men and women who once called themselves British, now called themselves Americans. They did not yet know what that meant, only that it was worth dying for. The British Empire, furious and unrelenting, sent its might against them. The redcoats marched through cities and fields, their banners flying, their drums echoing across the Atlantic. They came not to negotiate, but to crush. To the king, the colonies were not rebels, they were traitors, and traitors deserved no mercy. The young nation had no army, no navy, no treasury, only belief, only courage, only the stubborn conviction that liberty was worth more than life. In July 1776, as the ink of the Declaration dried, George Washington stood at the head of a ragged army outside New York. His men were farmers and blacksmiths, teachers and tradesmen, soldiers without uniforms, weapons, or hope of victory. They faced the most powerful military force in the world, tens of thousands of British troops, and hired German mercenaries. The summer heat carried the smell of gunpowder and fear. Washington knew that if the British captured his army, the revolution would end before it truly began. Yet he also knew that retreat was not surrender, it was survival. The Battle of Long Island was the first great test. The British forces landed in overwhelming numbers, flanking Washington's army. The Americans fought bravely, but were outmatched. Under the cover of night and fog, Washington ordered a daring retreat across the East River. Every boat, every oar, every man moved silently. By dawn, the army was gone. The British awoke to find the Americans vanished, saved by the tides and the courage of their commander. The retreat from New York was bitter, but it did not break the spirit of revolution. Washington wrote to Congress, "We must resolve to conquer or die." Those words became the creed of a generation. Through the fall of 1776, the Continental Army retreated through New Jersey, cold, hungry, and defeated. Many deserted. The dream of independence seemed to be dying. Yet, even in despair, hope flickered. In December, Washington made a decision that would change everything. He would attack on Christmas night. While the British celebrated in warmth and wine, Washington led his men across the icy Delaware River. The storm was brutal. Snow lashed their faces. Ice broke underfoot. But they pressed on. At dawn, they struck the British garrison at Trenton. The surprise was total. The battle was short, the victory complete. It was not just a military triumph, it was a resurrection. The world learned that America could fight. The soldiers learned that they could win. A few days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating the British once more. These victories rekindled the Revolution. The tide, at last, was beginning to turn. But the birth of a nation would not come easily. The war dragged on, year after year, across fields, mountains, and frozen rivers. For every victory, there was defeat. For every triumph, 1,000 losses. Towns burned, families starved, men froze to death in the snows of Valley Forge. There, in the winter of 1777 to 78, Washington's army nearly collapsed. They lacked food, clothing, and shelter. Disease spread through the camp. The suffering was beyond imagination. Yet through that misery, something extraordinary happened. Unity. At Valley Forge, soldiers from every colony, men who spoke with different accents, worshipped in different ways, and came from different worlds, became one army. They trained under the direction of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who drilled them with discipline and pride. Out of hunger came strength. Out of suffering came identity. The colonies were no longer separate peoples, they were Americans. In the summer of 1777, another turning point arrived. The British Army, under General Burgoyne, marched from Canada into New York, intending to cut the colonies in two. But at Saratoga, they met fierce resistance from American forces, led by General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. The battle raged for days. Muskets flashed through the trees, cannon smoke filled the air, and the wilderness became a graveyard of empire. When Burgoyne finally surrendered, the impossible had happened. A British army had been defeated by rebels. The victory at Saratoga changed everything. Across the ocean, France took notice. The French had long watched Britain's growing power with envy and resentment. Now, they saw an opportunity. In 1778, France formally allied with the United States, recognizing it as an independent nation. French ships and soldiers crossed the Atlantic, bringing supplies, money, and hope. The revolution had become a global war. As years passed, the struggle consumed both sides. The British occupied cities like New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia, but could not crush the spirit of resistance. Everywhere they went, the land itself seemed to rebel. Every farmer a fighter, every road a risk. Meanwhile, in the South, the war turned brutal. Villages were burned, prisoners massacred. Loyalists and patriots fought neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. It was no longer just a war for independence, it was a civil war of the soul. Through all of it, Washington stood unshaken. He was not a man of speeches, but of endurance. He lost battles, but never faith. His calm became the heartbeat of the revolution. Then, in 1781, the war reached its final act. British General Charles Cornwallis marched his army into Yorktown, Virginia, expecting reinforcements by sea, but the sea belonged to the French. Admiral de Grasse's fleet blocked the Chesapeake Bay, trapping Cornwallis. Washington saw his chance. Marching his army south from New York, joined by French General Rochambeau, he surrounded Yorktown. For weeks, cannons roared day and night. The ground shook with the birth pains of freedom. Then, on October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was over. The impossible had become real. When the news reached Philadelphia, church bells rang, crowds wept, and soldiers embraced in silence. Washington bowed his head, knowing the cost, the thousands who had died, the families torn apart, the dream that had nearly been lost. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The 13 colonies were now one nation. No king, no crown, no empire, only a people, bound by belief. When George Washington resigned his commission as commander-in-chief, he did not claim power for himself. He returned to his farm in Virginia. The world watched in awe. For the first time in history, a man who could have been king chose instead to be a citizen. This, too, was part of America's birth. The idea that leadership is service, not privilege. But the birth of a nation is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of one. The new United States faced questions as vast as its land. How would it govern itself? Could 13 independent states form a single union? Could the dream of liberty survive the reality of politics, ambition, and division? In 1787, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia, in the same hall where independence had been declared, to write a new document, the Constitution of the United States. It was not perfect, but it was profound. It created a republic, a government of laws, not of men. It declared that power came not from divine right, but from we the people. 4 years later, in 1789, George Washington took the oath as the nation's first president. The revolution had ended, but the experiment had only begun. The world watched this fragile republic, wondering how long it would last. Monarchs scoffed. Empires sneered. But America endured. It was not born from conquest or inheritance, but from conviction. It was not built on wealth or bloodline, but on belief. The belief that freedom is the right of all, and that governments exist to protect, not possess, that right. The birth of the United States was not a birth of perfection, but of promise. A promise that has been tested, broken, and renewed countless times. From the fields of revolution to the marches for equality, that promise remains the same, that liberty is a light no darkness can extinguish. In the years to come, the young nation would face wars, divisions, and doubts. But it would also become a symbol, not just to its own people, but to the world, of what humanity could be when it dares to be free. The birth of a nation is not measured by documents or borders, but by courage. By the willingness of people to rise above fear, to dream beyond their time, and to build something that lasts. In 1776, a few farmers and philosophers defied an empire. In 1781, they won a war. But the true victory was not in battle, it was in the idea that the governed could rule themselves. That power could belong to the people. That idea, once ignited, would cross oceans, topple kings, and inspire generations. And so, as we look back upon that dawn in 1776, upon the signatures in ink, the muskets in smoke, the stars that rose above a flag of 13 stripes, we see not the end of rebellion, but the beginning of civilization reborn. The United States of America was born not in peace, but in purpose. Not in comfort, but in courage. And its birth cry, the cry for freedom, still echoes across the world.